Hello, everyone, and welcome back to our second episode of Why Do We Need Accountability in Yemen series from Watana for Human Rights. In the previous podcast, we gave a brief background about the Yemen's situation at the UN Human Rights Council between 2017, the year of establishing the UN Group of Eminent Experts on Yemen, as known as GEE, and 2021, and the year of ending its mandate. In this episode, we are glad to host distinguished guests to discuss international criminal accountability in Yemen. Let's first welcome our guests. We have Priyanka Mutparty, the Director of Armed Conflict, Counterterrorism and Human Rights Project at Columbia Law School, Human Rights Institute. The second guest is Nico Jafrania, Yemen and Bahrain researcher at Human Rights Watch. Bisan Faqih, the Yemen and Iraq campaigner at Amnesty International. And last but not least, we have Radhia Mutawakkil, the chairperson of Muatana. Thank you all for joining us. Priyanka, the mandate of the GEE on Yemen ended in October 2021. Civil society organizations have not stopped pushing for an international mechanism with a criminal focus to investigate violations in Yemen. Can you brief our listeners on the meaning of an international mechanism of a criminal nature? What is expected of this mechanism, and what can the UN bodies establish?
This would be a mechanism that collects evidence to the standard required for a criminal trial where possible, and investigates questions that are essential for future international criminal cases. This could include research into perpetrators of crimes, as well as evidence linking them to crimes. Such a mechanism would prepare files to support future criminal accountability processes, whether those are national level cases, universal jurisdiction cases, or international court cases. There are a few key recent examples of an international criminally focused mechanism. These include the Syria IIIM, the International Impartial and Independent Mechanism for Syria, which was established by the UN General Assembly through a resolution. There's also the Myanmar IIMM. This is the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, which was established by a Human Rights Council resolution. So how can such bodies be established? They can be established through the UN Security Council, though politically that has not been a viable option for some time. They can also be established by the UN General Assembly or by the UN Human Rights Council by resolution of member states.
Thank you, Priyanka. And now the question to Nico. Nico, what is your assessment of the position of the member states at the UN Human Rights Council? And what are the main obstacles to the establishment of such mechanism?
I really think that since the disbanding of the Group of Eminent Experts in 2021, states have really just dropped their calls for an investigative mechanism. And this is in spite of the very, very clear and obvious need that they're for an investigative mechanism and for broader accountability. You know, particularly after the truce happened last year and with ongoing negotiations now between warring parties for the possibility of a renewed truce, I feel that many states have just been hopeful that there will simply be an end to the conflict and that there will be another truce and that will lead to, you know, a long-term peace. But the problem with this is that, you know, of course it would be great for long-term peace to arrive now. But these states have this narrative that they're supporting this push for peace and that accountability will get in the way of that peace. In fact, you know, that's absolutely not what research has shown us. Human Rights Watch actually published a report all the way back in 2009 that shows that sustainable peace is, in fact, not achievable without real accountability. This is a message we've continued to support and obviously a message that I know Muatana clearly stands by. And, you know, when we're talking about real accountability and reparations and, you know, real justice in the case of this conflict, that requires an effective independent investigative mechanism first and foremost. I mean, how are we supposed to go about, you know, actually achieving any form of reparations or determining what accountability looks like without having had investigations into the violation? That's impossible. So right now, I really don't feel that there are states who believe that the establishment of an investigative mechanism for Yemen is even possible at the Human Rights Council at the moment. I mean, we have Luxembourg, which has been a state that's really a strong supporter and has been pushing for the council to pay attention to the need for accountability in Yemen. But generally, states that otherwise might be supportive of a mechanism are genuinely concerned that they wouldn't have the numbers to pull it off. Like they're worried that if they actually voted yes, that other states, not enough states would vote for it, and ultimately it would fail. And it's not like they just vote when it comes to this. They feel that they're spending political capital in these votes, and so it's like a bargaining game, right? They have other priorities at the Human Rights Council that they're pushing for. When they don't feel that they're going to win on this front, they'll put those bargaining chips into a different priority of theirs and push for other issues in other countries. In terms of the main obstacles to the establishment of this mechanism, unfortunately, there's many, and I wish that weren't the case. In addition to what I stated above in terms of, political capital, and in terms of states just not being willing to really push for this, first and foremost is Saudi Arabia as an obstacle, and the UAE. Saudi's lobbying efforts were the entire reason that the Group of Eminent Experts wasn't renewed in 2021. And that hasn't changed. Their interests haven't changed. They threatened states who were planning to vote in favor of the GE or who were planning to abstain, and they forced them to change their vote. Of course they're doing this. They're doing everything in their power to ensure that there's no investigative mechanism because they've been responsible for such pervasive and extensive civilian harm in this conflict. And they have no interest in having a UN body come into Yemen and investigate the violations of human rights law and international law broadly that they've committed. On this note, that's true of a lot of states that are unfortunately some of the most powerful players in this Human Rights Council. When we're talking about the UK, the US, France, Germany, each of these countries has been complicit in violations. They've all profited from this conflict. And while they might have, voted in favor of an accountability mechanism, they're not necessarily willing to be the states to push for accountability and push for the establishment of this investigative mechanism. But in reality, after this disbanding of the GEE, it's really critical that one of these states is one of the countries that's going to lead that effort, because smaller states, while they might want to push, and it's incredibly critical, and I don't mean to downplay their efforts, it's very, very critical that they are pushing for an accountability mechanism and an investigative mechanism in particular. They still need other larger, more powerful states to be able to stand with them and to lead the charge in order to actually, push this forward. There's also so many issues lingering in the background. There's the war in Ukraine and the current energy crisis that's caused, which means that states are even less likely now to do anything to damage their relationship with countries like Saudi Arabia that are providing them with oil and gas. So it's just it's an incredibly complex web of obstacles, and yet where we land is still the same, where accountability and justice is absolutely critical for Yemen. There's no discussion of peace that's possible without discussing the need for accountability in the context of the Yemeni conflict. And so, if we're going to be continuing to talk about a truce, to talk about, peace and the end, and even an end to the conflict, we absolutely cannot be doing this without first having an investigative mechanism and establishing the need and putting in the resources for accountability.
Thank you, Nico. Thank you, Bisan, for joining us. With the absence of the GE and the lack of an investigative mechanism to date, what is the responsibility of human rights organizations to bridge this gap?
Let me first start by saying that it is a travesty that the mandate of the Group of Eminent Experts on Yemen was not renewed in October 2021. This is a historic failure, and it's a shameful mark on the record of the UN Human Rights Council, which succumbed to fierce lobbying from Saudi Arabia and its partners. Saudi Arabia, which is in fact a party to the conflict in Yemen and has perpetrated war crimes. This is very much a dereliction of duty by the Human Rights Council of the highest order, and I think we should constantly remind of that when we're making a call for a new investigative mechanism. So the role of the GEE, or the Group of Eminent Experts on Yemen, was to investigate and collect evidence of serious violations and abuses of international human rights law and international humanitarian law perpetrated by all parties to the armed conflict. So this was especially critical because the lack of documentation and evidence gathering by a credible independent body will deny victims of violations their right to seek justice and reparations, while it also breeding a climate of impunity that will help perpetrate abuses. So therefore, this body, it didn't just deal with the past, but crucially, it served to discourage future violations. And when we're calling for an independent and impartial mechanism, that is what we're hoping it will do, which is, have some kind of accountability for past violations, but also discourage future ones. So at Amnesty International, we have called and will continue to call on the UN to act urgently to establish a new UN-led accountability mechanism, an independent and impartial body that is criminally focused and would investigate and publicly report on the most serious violations and abuses of international law committed in Yemen. And the other thing we would expect this UN-led accountability mechanism to do is collect and preserve evidence and prepare files for possible future criminal prosecution. The people of Yemen are owed justice and reparations for the crimes committed against them, and so this accountability mechanism is absolutely essential. And we're documenting a litany of abuses right now. So despite a ceasefire agreement last year, which has de facto held but did expire, parties to the conflict continue to carry out unlawful attacks that killed and injured civilians. They interfered with their access to humanitarian aid and destroyed civilian objects. So we stand very much with our colleagues at Muwatana for Human Rights and other local and international human rights organizations in making this demand for a UN-led accountability mechanism. And just to summarize again, what elements are essential to any new mechanism in order for it to be effective in addressing accountability for violations. It would be first, to investigate all alleged violations and abuses of human rights and violations of international humanitarian law by all parties to the conflict, and to establish the facts and circumstances of violations. So that's the first crucial element. The second element of this accountability mechanism would be to collect, consolidate, preserve, and analyze evidence of the most serious international crimes and violations of international law since 2014 for possible future criminal proceedings in accordance with international law standards, and of course to publicly issue its findings. And the third crucial element to this new mechanism would be to identify individuals and entities responsible for violations, with a view to ensuring that those responsible are held accountable, and with a view also to providing reparations to the victims. So any future accountability mechanism would have to have all of these elements that I've just mentioned. Now, in the absence of the GEE, human rights organizations have a really important role to play in advocating for this mechanism. We need to make sure that this mechanism, when it's established, it contains all of the elements that I've just outlined above, and of course, which our colleagues at Muwatana and other human rights organizations have advocated for. And we need to ensure that we're not bullied or forced to cower to the demands of powerful states, many of whom have participated in crimes in Yemen, and which were responsible for, making sure that the mandate of the GEE was not renewed. And of course, during this time, until this mechanism is established, and it must be established, human rights organizations like Muwatana, like Amnesty, both local, regional, and also international human rights organizations, must persevere in documenting and collecting evidence of violations. And I think of colleagues on the ground in Yemen who are bravely doing this work with impressive reach, such as my colleagues at Muwatana for Human Rights. And, in order for them to be able to continue doing their work, in order for human rights documentation to continue, all of these organizations must benefit from access, they must be protected, and they must be resourced in order to be able to do this crucial human rights work, which they've done very, very bravely against tremendous odds.
This is very informative, Bisan. Thank you so much. Radia, in the case of reaching a political agreement to end the armed conflict, is there still a need for an international criminally focused investigative mechanism for Yemen?
Sure. As we all know, that during the war, the 8 years of the conflict in Yemen, there was a huge lack of accountability. And this huge lack of accountability helped all parties to the conflict to commit more violations against civilians and civilian objects. So having a criminally focused investigative mechanism, it's not only for the past, it's also for the future. To protect civilians in the future because of any conflict that might happen in the future. And having such a mechanism that can put a real pressure on parties to the conflict regarding human rights violations will even help to sustain the peace, will help Yemenis to have a sustainable peace. So yes, as we do need a criminally focused investigative mechanism during the war, we still need it even more during the peace in order to cut all the relations between the past and the future, and to start to build a future where we know that civilians can be protected, not only protected, but also can have the justice with not having any shape of accountability, or having such a mechanism that can guarantee accountability in the future. We will still be living in the atmosphere of impunity, and violations can be committed by any party to the conflict or by any authority that might control Yemen during now or the future.
Thank you so much, Radia. I would like to thank our guests for their valuable participation in this episode, and I'd like to also to thank our listeners. Stay tuned for the next podcast episode in Why Do We Need Accountability in Yemen series from Watana for Human Rights.